Elderly woman returns from death with a terrifying message from Jesus. Helen had always been cautious. At 82, she knew better than to take unnecessary risks, especially in her old home with its steep, narrow staircase. But tonight, something pulled at her, a longing she couldn't ignore. She was searching for a specific photo album, one tucked away in the attic for decades. The images inside held memories of her late husband, her children when they were small, and her younger self when the world seemed simpler. The thought of holding those memories again filled her with a bittersweet ache. The clock ticked past 9 p.m. as Helen reached the staircase. Her daughter Grace had warned her countless times about the danger of climbing those stairs alone. "Mum, just let me get whatever you need," Grace had said earlier that evening before leaving. But Helen, fiercely independent even in her old age, didn't want to bother anyone. She gripped the wooden banister tightly and began her slow ascent. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, each step an effort as her knees protested. Halfway up, her foot brushed the edge of the carpet runner and a jolt of uncertainty ran through her. She paused, taking a deep breath. "Just a little further," she murmured to herself, determined to reach the top. But as she took the next step, her slipper caught on the edge of the carpet. The world seemed to tilt, and Helen's body lurched backward. Her hand shot out to grab the railing, but her fingers missed. She fell, tumbling down the stairs in a blur of motion and pain. The last thing she remembered was the cold, hard impact of the wooden floor against her back and the sound of something, a vase perhaps, shattering nearby. Then everything went dark. Time passed, though Helen wasn't sure how long. At first, there was nothing but silence, a silence so deep it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Then came a sensation, lightness, as if she were floating. Helen opened her eyes, expecting to see the ceiling of her home or the concerned faces of paramedics. Instead, she found herself hovering above the scene of her fall. Her body lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, eerily still. The sight made her gasp, though no sound escaped her lips. She saw Grace rushing into the house, her face pale and stricken with panic. "Mom! Oh my God, Mom!" Grace shouted, dropping to her knees beside Helen's lifeless form. Helen wanted to call out, to reassure her daughter that she was okay, or at least she thought she was. But as she tried to speak, she felt herself being drawn upward. The room below her began to blur, the cries of her daughter fading into the distance. She wasn't frightened, though. The sensation was strange, but oddly comforting, as if invisible hands were guiding her somewhere she was meant to go. The world around Helen dissolved into a soft, glowing light. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but warm and inviting. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if all the worries, aches, and regrets of her earthly life had been lifted from her shoulders. The pain from her fall was gone, replaced by a serenity she couldn't explain. As she drifted further into the light, Helen noticed shapes forming around her, indistinct at first, but gradually becoming clearer. She was standing in a vast field, more beautiful than anything she had ever seen. The grass shimmered like emeralds, and flowers bloomed in colors that seemed almost otherworldly. The air was filled with a music she couldn't describe, a melody that resonated deep within her soul. Helen looked down at herself and realized she wasn't wearing her old house dress anymore. Instead, she was clothed in a simple yet elegant garment of white, soft as silk and glowing faintly. She raised her hands and stared at them in amazement. They looked young again, unmarked by age or arthritis. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice steady despite the wonder she felt. As if in answer, figures began to appear in the distance. They were radiant, their forms surrounded by a soft glow. Though their faces were indistinct, Helen felt an immediate connection to them, a sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. They seemed to know her, and their presence filled her with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The figures gestured for her to follow, and Helen felt herself moving effortlessly toward them. She didn't walk, she glided, as though the ground itself carried her forward. The landscape grew brighter as she approached, the light intensifying but never hurting her eyes. Ahead of her, standing at the center of this radiant realm, was a figure unlike any she had ever seen. He was tall, clothed in a robe of pure light that seemed to shimmer with every color of the spectrum. His face was kind and filled with a love so deep it made Helen's chest ache. She didn't need to ask who he was. She knew. Her knees gave way, and she fell to the ground before him, overcome by awe and reverence. "Jesus," she whispered, her voice trembling. He extended a hand to her, his touch gentle, yet filled with a power that seemed to course through her entire being. "Helen," he said, his voice soft, but carrying an authority that demanded attention. "Rise." She stood, feeling weightless and strong. For the first time in years, there was no pain, no stiffness in her joints. She looked into his eyes, and it felt as though he could see every part of her, her fears, her joys, her regrets. And yet, he loved her completely. "There is much you must see," he said, his tone serious yet compassionate. "And there is much you must understand before you return." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "Return? Do you mean I'm not staying?" Jesus smiled, a faint sadness in his expression. "Not yet. Your time is not finished. But before you go, you must know the truth." The light around them shifted, and Helen felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever she was about to see, she knew it would change her forever. Helen stood before Jesus, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and unease. The warmth of his presence was like nothing she had ever felt before, comforting yet commanding. She couldn't look away from his eyes, which seemed to hold the weight of eternity within them. His gaze was tender, but carried an urgency that made her uneasy. Whatever he was about to show her, she knew it would be significant, life-altering, and perhaps even terrifying. "You are loved beyond measure," Jesus began, his voice resonating with a depth that seemed to echo through her very soul. "But the world you have left, the one you must soon return to, is at a precipice. There is much to see and much to understand." Helen nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, so she simply listened as Jesus lifted his hand. The radiant light around them began to shift and ripple like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. Colors swirled together, forming shapes and images that became clearer with each passing moment. Helen found herself standing in a different place entirely. She saw the earth as though from a great height. The planet seemed to shimmer with life, its oceans glistening and its lands teeming with movement. At first, the sight filled her with a sense of wonder, but as she looked closer, her heart sank. Parts of the world were cloaked in darkness, dense, oppressive shadows that crept across cities and landscapes like living things. The contrast was stark, a battle between light and shadow that seemed to rage silently but relentlessly. Jesus stood beside her, his face grave. "The world is not beyond redemption, but it is in peril," he said. "The forces of light and darkness are at war, not in ways the eyes can always see, but in ways that shape the hearts of humanity. Choices made now will ripple across generations." Helen watched as the images shifted again. She saw people from all walks of life, parents, children, workers, leaders. Some shone brightly, their actions fueled by kindness, faith, and love. Others were surrounded by shadows, their faces twisted with greed, anger, and despair. The darkness seemed to feed on their choices, growing stronger with each selfish act. "Why are you showing me this?" Helen asked, her voice trembling. "Because you have a role to play," Jesus replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Each person who chooses the light strengthens it. But there are others, those in positions of great influence, whose choices hold far greater weight." The images shifted once more, and Helen's breath caught. She saw a familiar face emerge from the swirling colors. Donald Trump. He was standing at the center of a chaotic scene, surrounded by swirling forces she couldn't fully comprehend. On one side, there were figures cloaked in light, reaching out to him, guiding him. On the other, shadowy forms whispered in his ear, their movements subtle but insidious. Trump stood still, his expression a mixture of confidence and confusion, as though he were caught between two opposing tides. Helen turned to Jesus, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why him? Why are you showing me him?" Jesus' expression softened, though the weight of his words was undeniable. "He is a man given great influence, and with that influence comes immense responsibility. But he is surrounded by forces that seek to manipulate, to corrupt, and to twist his purpose. His decisions have the power to shape not just nations, but the hearts of millions." Helen's knees felt weak, but she remained standing. "What am I supposed to do with this? I'm just an old woman. How could I possibly make a difference?" Jesus placed a hand on her shoulder, and she felt a surge of strength course through her. "The smallest voices often carry the greatest truths," he said. "You are not called to control the actions of others, but to speak, to warn, and to remind the world of what truly matters. Love, humility, and vigilance are more powerful than you can imagine." The scene grew darker, the shadows around Trump intensifying. Helen could see them taking on more defined shapes, figures that seemed to embody greed, deception, and division. They whispered words she couldn't hear, but their intentions were clear. The forces of light tried to push back, but their influence was tenuous, as though they were being drowned out. "What happens if he listens to them?" Helen asked, her voice breaking. Jesus' expression turned somber. "The darkness will grow, and its reach will extend far beyond what you can see now. But remember this, no path is irreversible. Even in the darkest moments, light can break through. That is why vigilance is needed, why prayer and action must go hand in hand." Helen watched as the vision began to dissolve, replaced by the radiant realm she had first entered. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of what she had seen, but Jesus' presence steadied her. "This is not meant to frighten you," he said, his voice filled with compassion. "It is meant to prepare you. The world must wake up, Helen, and you have been chosen to help sound the alarm." Helen looked into his eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Jesus said, his words filled with unwavering certainty. "Strength is not found in power or control. It is found in faith, in truth, and in love. And you have all of these in abundance." For a moment, Helen felt a deep sense of peace. But the memory of the shadows lingered in her mind, a stark reminder of the urgency of the message she now carried. As the light around her began to shift again, she realized her journey was far from over. The radiant realm began to fade, and Helen felt a strange sensation pulling her away. It was as if invisible threads were tugging her gently but firmly back toward the world she had left behind. The warm glow of Jesus' presence lingered, and his final words echoed in her mind. "The smallest acts of faith can shine brighter than the greatest darkness." She clung to those words as the light around her dimmed. Her surroundings shifted, and she was plunged into a tunnel of swirling colors, sensations, and fleeting sounds. It wasn't frightening. but it was overwhelming. She felt as though she were moving through time and space, each moment stretching and collapsing simultaneously. Flashes of her life flickered before her: her wedding day, the birth of her children, the quiet nights spent with her late husband. Each memory was vivid, brimming with emotion, and she realized how much beauty and pain her life had held. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the motion stopped. Helen gasped as she opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. The air was cold, sterile, and entirely different from the warmth of the place she had just been. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had truly returned. But the sharp ache in her body made it clear she was back. Her daughter Grace was sitting by the hospital bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. When Grace saw Helen stir, she let out a small cry of relief and grabbed her mother's hand. "Mom, oh, thank God. I thought I lost you," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Helen tried to speak, but her throat felt dry and raw. She managed a faint smile, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I'm here," she rasped, though the words felt heavier than they should. She wasn't just here in the room. She was back in the world, carrying a message she could barely comprehend. The days that followed were a blur of doctors, tests, and physical therapy. Helen's fall had left her with broken ribs and a fractured wrist, but the medical team was astounded by her recovery. "It's a miracle," one nurse said, shaking her head. "At her age, a fall like that could have been fatal." Helen nodded politely, but inside she knew the truth. It was a miracle, but not in the way they thought. She had been sent back for a reason, and as her strength returned, so did the weight of her experience. The visions she had seen and the words Jesus had spoken played over and over in her mind, refusing to be ignored. One quiet evening, after Grace had gone home to rest, Helen sat alone in her hospital bed, staring out the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the radiant light she had seen in the other realm. She couldn't stop thinking about the shadows, the warning about Donald Trump, and the terrifying implications of the forces at play. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in prayer. "What do I do, Lord?" she whispered. "How can I, an old woman, carry such a heavy message? Who will believe me?" As if in answer, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The words Jesus had spoken echoed in her heart. "You are not called to control, but to speak. Truth carries its own power." The next day, Helen decided to share part of her experience with Grace. Her daughter had always been pragmatic, someone who relied on logic and reason. Helen wasn't sure how she would react, but she knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. "Grace," she began carefully as her daughter sat beside her bed, scrolling through her phone. "I need to tell you something. It's important." Grace set the phone down and leaned closer, her expression wary. "What is it, Mom? Is something wrong?" Helen shook her head. "No, nothing's wrong. But while I was gone, I saw things. I met someone." Grace frowned, clearly confused. "You mean in a dream?" Helen hesitated, then shook her head again. "No, this wasn't a dream, Grace. It was real. I met Jesus." The words hung in the air, heavy and almost impossible to believe. Grace's eyes widened and she leaned back slightly, as though trying to process what she had just heard. "Mom, are you sure? I mean, you hit your head. Maybe it was—" "I know what I saw," Helen interrupted, her voice firm but calm. "And I know what I felt. He showed me things, Grace. Things about the world, about people, about what's coming." Grace was silent for a long moment, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. Finally, she asked, "What did he show you?" Helen's hands tightened around the blanket as she struggled to find the right words. He showed me the world, its beauty and its brokenness, and he showed me Donald Trump. Grace blinked in surprise. Trump? What does he have to do with this? Helen hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to overwhelm her daughter, but she also couldn't hold back the truth. He's important, she said carefully. More important than people realize. But he's surrounded by forces, Grace. Dark forces that want to twist his influence for their own purposes. Jesus said the world's future depends on vigilance, not just from him, but from all of us. Grace stared at her mother, her face unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. I don't know, Mom. This is a lot to take in. I understand, Helen said softly. But I'm telling you because I need your help. I don't know what to do with this. I don't even know where to start. Grace reached for her mother's hand, her grip firm. Let's take it one step at a time. If this is real, if you truly believe it, then we'll figure it out together. Helen felt a surge of gratitude, though she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The message she carried was both a gift and a burden, and she was only beginning to understand what it would demand of her. The hospital discharge was bittersweet for Helen. As she sat in her daughter Grace's car on the way home, she felt the gravity of her experience pressing down on her. The physical wounds from her fall would heal, but the message she carried was a weight she couldn't ignore. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by, feeling both comforted by their normalcy and disoriented by the profound knowledge she now held. Back home, Grace helped her settle into her favorite armchair in the living room. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of fresh flowers Grace had brought earlier. But Helen couldn't relax. Her mind raced with questions. How would she share what she had seen? Would anyone believe her? And what if they didn't? The next few days were filled with small, hesitant conversations. Helen tried to bring up pieces of her experience with Grace, but each time she stopped short, afraid of sounding irrational. Grace was supportive, but Helen could sense her skepticism. It wasn't until the fourth evening after Helen's return that she found the courage to speak fully. They were sitting together, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room. A news broadcast played in the background, discussing the latest political developments. Helen's attention snapped to the screen as the anchor mentioned Donald Trump. Her chest tightened. This was her moment. Grace, Helen began, her voice trembling slightly. I need you to hear me out. All of it. Grace muted the TV and turned to her mother, concern in her eyes. Of course, Mom. What's on your mind? Helen took a deep breath. When I was gone, I saw things. Jesus showed me the state of the world, not just what's happening now, but what could happen. He showed me Donald Trump, standing at the center of it all, surrounded by forces I can't fully describe. They were pulling at him, whispering in his ear. Some were trying to guide him toward the light, but others were dark, manipulative. They want to use him, Grace, to sow division and chaos. Grace frowned but didn't interrupt. Helen continued, her voice gaining strength. Jesus said the world is at a crossroads. The choices made by those in power will shape the future, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. And Trump? He's a key figure in all of this. His decisions, his actions, they have the power to tip the balance. Grace exhaled slowly, her brows furrowing in thought. And what are we supposed to do about it, Mom? I mean, we're just us, regular people. Helen reached for her daughter's hand. That's the part I'm struggling with. Jesus didn't give me a blueprint or a clear instruction. He only said that we must be vigilant. We can't let darkness take root in our hearts or in the hearts of our leaders. He said prayer, truth, and love are our greatest weapons." Grace nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. "Okay, so we pray, we stay informed, and we talk to people. But do you really think anyone will listen, Mum? It's such a big message, and people these days, they don't believe in things like this." Helen smiled faintly. "I know it won't be easy, but even if just one person listens, even if just one heart is moved, it's worth it. Light spreads, Grace. It only takes a spark." The next morning, Helen made a decision. She would share her story publicly, no matter how frightening the prospect. She started by writing everything down, every detail of her near-death experience, every word Jesus had spoken, every image burned into her memory. It wasn't an easy task. Her hands trembled as she wrote, and tears often blurred her vision. But she pressed on, knowing the importance of preserving her account. Grace helped her set up a small gathering at their local church. Word spread quickly, and on the day of the event, the small sanctuary was filled with neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers who had heard whispers of Helen's story. She stood at the front of the room, leaning slightly on a cane for support, her heart pounding as she faced the expectant crowd. "I don't have all the answers," Helen began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But I know what I saw, and I know it's too important to keep to myself." She recounted her fall, her journey to the radiant realm, and her meeting with Jesus. She described the visions of light and darkness, the warnings about the world's precarious state, and the cryptic yet urgent message about Donald Trump. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical, but no one interrupted. "I don't tell you this to scare you," Helen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I tell you because I believe we have a chance to change the course of things. It starts with us, with the choices we make every day. It starts with prayer, with holding our leaders accountable, and with spreading love instead of fear." When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then a single person began to clap, followed by another and another, until the entire room was filled with applause. Helen felt a surge of relief and hope. Even if not everyone believed her, they had listened. They had heard the message. In the weeks that followed, Helen's story spread. Local news stations picked it up, and her account began circulating online. Some mocked her, dismissing her as a delusional old woman. But others were moved, inspired to reflect on their own lives and the state of the world. For Helen, the mission was far from over. She continued to share her message wherever she could, knowing that the ripple effects of her words might reach places she could never imagine. And though the burden of what she had seen remained heavy, she carried it with faith, trusting in the words Jesus had spoken. The smallest acts of faith can shine brighter than the greatest darkness.